All right, welcome back to the channel. So, Teddy Atlas speaks from the bottom of his heart about what's going on in the world relative to these protests, and he tries to guilt trip you as a way to cover up what his true feelings most likely are. Let's talk about Teddy Atlas and what Teddy Atlas had to say. All right, welcome back. So, Teddy Atlas, former trainer of Mike Tyson, former ESPN commentator, current YouTube commentator. I think he might do some special things for some other networks. But you know, Teddy, the boxing commentator, had something to say about the protests that have been taking place related to the very, very unfortunate situation, George Floyd situation. Now, what does Teddy have to say? Teddy, of course, says, hey, we have, matter of fact, probably best just to read it. Teddy Atlas says, George Floyd and retired police captain David Dorn have a couple things in common. Both are black and both were just murdered. Where the commonality ends is remembrance. Floyd's death will bring change. So should Dorn's. R.I.P. Okay, now right there, that sounds as if he is sensitive about the plight of the protesters, but also concerned about what happened to this retired police officer. So let's talk about, well, first, let me tell you what he's trying to do, and then let me explain it. He's trying to guilt trip you, is what he's trying to do. He is equating George Floyd, right, with a retired police department, retired police captain David Dorn. So let's see who these two people are first. We know who George Floyd is. Minding his business, gets snatched out, not doing anything whatsoever, murdered right there for whatever he was suspected of. I don't even know what he suspected of, what they suspected of him at this point in time, right? But in police custody, hands behind his back, laid onto a ground, 3 people on his back, 1 guy on his neck, sit there till 8 minutes until the guy goes, right? Dead in the face of people who are asking, citizens surrounding them, asking them to stop. David Dorn. David Dorn is a retired police officer who was defending a pawn shop. So he's a retired police officer, which means he's no longer a police officer. He's a citizen. A citizen defending a pawn shop that was getting looted and or being robbed. Another way to probably say that, better way to say that, is a pawn shop was getting robbed by people that were also, in the same environment as the protests. However you want to say that, right? Now, first scenario, terribly wrong. Second scenario, terribly wrong. The man should not have had to lose his life protecting other people, protecting property from people coming in, right? Both are bad. So I'm sure you hear those type of things presented to you on a regular basis, right? Where you say, well, yes, we know these people are wrong, but so are these. Okay. Yes, this guy was wrong, but this is the part that he played in the equation to get this guy upset at him. So let's look at both sides of this and see how we can fix people on both sides, right? That's the argument you hear constantly. That is what Teddy Atlas is saying here. And what I'm saying to you is that's complete and utter worthless trash. Two, and this is the way that I see it. there is something called negligence. You sue somebody for negligence, right? Because they were supposed to do something. This is an example to explain the point. Say you have a store, right? And your store, you sell something to somebody and you sell them a hot dog. And the hot dog is old, right? And it's moldy between the hot dog and between the bun. You sell it to somebody. They eat it. They buy it, they leave the store, they eat it. It makes you sick. It makes them sick, right? Now, who's at fault? Is it you who sold the hot dog, or is it the person that looks at the hot dog, doesn't look at the hot dog, or might have seen the hot dog, right? Saw that there was some mold on there. He was told by people in there not to buy the hot dog. He eats the hot dog and he gets sick. Whose fault is it? Well, it's this guy's fault for selling it to you, and it's this guy's fault also for eating it when everybody told him it was moldy and don't buy it, right? Now, who's at fault? Is it this guy or is it this guy? Well, there's a concept called contributory negligence, right? So one guy, the guy that ate the hot dog, would say, you were negligent in selling me this hot dog that was moldy. And the other, but in defense of that, the guy can say, yeah, but everybody told you. I heard them tell you when you walked in the door that it was a moldy hot dog. I didn't know what you wanted to do with the hot dog. I sold you the hot dog. So yes, I'm at part fault, but so are you, because you knew that the mold was there, right? Just a very loose argument. Okay. So there is just to explain to you that concept. Negligence and contributory negligence. Now, what's the similarity? The similarity is that it is trying to distribute blame based on each person's contribution to what happened, right? The same thing when people are trying to do when they talk about whether or not in protests that were incited because of issues with police, that if somebody that is at the protest breaks somebody's windows or somebody's property gets damaged, right? That there's, right? It's trying to you're trying to give, blame and figure, well, this is X percentage of the problem and this is Y percentage of the problem. Okay. That's what Teddy Atlas is trying. That's what Teddy Atlas is trying to do. Now, I think that is a completely and utterly fallacious way to look at this particular situation. What I believe is that both groups should be judged under the same standard. Now, in the standard that people are using to support the officers in this particular case, and what they've done is pretty much a concept of similar to the concept that's put forth in one of the tenets of what's called political realism, right? So if you're looking at what the state does, because that's what the police are part of the state, right? But in what there's a particular phrase that goes like this: to confuse and it's by Hans Morgenthau, to confuse the individual, the morality of the individual, with that of the nation state is to court national disaster. Let me repeat that so I do it a little more smoothly. To confuse the morality of the individual with that of the nation state is to court national disaster. What that means is that state entities can do things for the good of the state, right? That if an individual were to do it would be considered immoral. So that is the justification for wars. That's the justification for going into people's countries and having coup d'etats and all these other things. Because yes, when we look at what the state is doing, it is immoral. But that's because we look at it from the viewpoint of an individual. And according to that tenet, To confuse the morality of the individual with that of the nation state is to court disaster, which means it's just not going to work. So if that's the standard that people use, and they use that on a local basis to support this type of activity that occurred to George Floyd, they say, hey, you know, the police officers, they work for the state. And their job is they don't have the same, that's why they get qualified immunity, right? Because to kill, for if I as a regular citizen was to do that, oh no, that's an issue. But if a man with a uniform on, it's not an issue. Why? Because the morality of that officer, the person in the uniform, is of the morality of the state, right? And his morality is not the same morality that I have. Right? So you hold them, you give them more leeway in order to protect the nation, right? By letting what's moral for them have a little bit or a lot more room. That's what Drew Titan, shout out to Drew Titan on his channel, go check him out, talks about the 5 levels of escalation and all that. But you get my point. So in this scenario, you would say, who are the two groups that Teddy Atlas is speaking of? Teddy Atlas is speaking of the state and a mass of people. So if you flip the same theory that people have to justify actions by the people in the uniforms, and because that is a nation, because he represents the nation state, well, so do the protesters. They represent the nation. They represent a group of people because they are the people. So to confuse the morality of a mass of people which you can't even control with that of one individual in it is to absolutely create disaster for that movement. It will never be successful with people who do that, who say, oh, let me judge this movement in all of the individual acts that happen within it as an individual, as the moral judgment of that individual, and not think of it as a collective that are moving forward to try to do something. And you're going to have some things that happen that you might not want to happen or might not be acceptable if this was just one guy, Joe Blow, walking down the street. You have a scenario, and this is something that Chris Hedges said, and he was talking about the war in Sarajevo. He's a political correspondent that covers these, and he's like, this is a guy that is a preacher and is very, very nonviolent, understands that violence, it's a path that is, it's a dangerous one for certain, and something that should be avoided at all costs. But he says when people are surrounded and, the city is, you're in trench state where they're literally digging trenches around the city to keep people from coming in. At that point in time, when you're under siege, people are not going to be sitting around talking about nonviolence. They're going to say, hey, man, if I know what's going to happen if I don't do something. They're going to come into my house. They're going to snatch me up. They're going to, if I live at all, they're going to put me on a bus and they're going to go put me in that camp. So I have to defend myself, right? Even that is within the morality of the individual. However, I use that to demonstrate it at a certain point. And here's another point that I want to make because this video is getting too long. Also, you have to understand that when you are dealing with, when somebody begins an issue, when they are the starting point, right? The reaction to what somebody else does is a result of their actions. So they are the but-for cause of it, right? That's another reason to say, when you say, well, exactly who should be held responsible for this? It's called the but-for cause. So you can get as close to the original problem. In this scenario that Teddy Atlas is talking about, the original problem are the people in uniforms and the actions that they have done. The things that they did in order to incite people and get people so desperate that they're willing to do things that otherwise they wouldn't do. So they are not only culpable in their own actions, they are also culpable in the actions that are a direct result of their actions. No less than a man that raises a child, that abuses a child, is responsible for that child, in part is responsible for what that child does when he leaves his house. And the things that they did as a direct result of the abuse that they would have been suffering. They are the but-for cause of it. If they did not do what they did, most likely Mr. Dorn would not have been in that situation. So they not only own they don't only have their problem with the things that they've actually done, they also should be held responsible for the things that happen as a direct result of their actions that were predictable and foreseeable, or I don't want to be redundant. But anyway, you get my point. This is a bit of a long video, and with that, I'm out. Peace.